This is Washington, Indiana, the town where I was born, the town where I grew up, the place I lived till I was 30 before moving out east. There is on both sides of this street at the intersection of 2nd and Main, there is a memory here, for this is where it all started. In the early 1800s, a man named Flora started a fort here. It was a fortification, but it was also a trading post. Within 10 years, a small city would begin to develop here, first called Liverpool, and then renamed Washington. And it's a little hard to comprehend why anybody would start a city or build a fort or put a store here, because this whole area looked like this. It was highly forested. There were creeks through here, but not a river. An Indian trail, yes, and the railroad would be a long time in coming. And when that pioneer trading post was set up by David Flora, what would become Washington was in the middle of nowhere. The area was slowly being divided up into regions that would eventually become states. What would become Daviess County was part of a large tract that was an area developed because of a treaty with American Indians in 1803, just a little over a decade before Flora settled here. This was the wilderness. The only thing on maps was the tiny village of Vincennes. But Washington grew because of its proximity to Vincennes, which was the seat of everything, and its closeness to a major canal, the presence of a primitive trail path that would eventually become a stagecoach line. Trees were felled, the wood used to build the first dwellings, log cabins, not an uncommon sight on the prairie. Soon a plat for streets was worked out and Washington began to modernize. That first plat spread out from the original center of town, 2nd and Main. Some streets were eventually named for the city's founding fathers. And today, luckily, we can still find some of the first homes that were built when the city was modernized. And in the years just before the Civil War, this city started growing like gangbusters. Beautiful homes went up. The Van Trees family, which had helped settle this city, the second generation Van Trees, John built this house. They made the bricks here. And John befriended a young man from Illinois who stopped here now and then. That guy's name was Abraham Lincoln. Prim little home, isn't it? This is the oldest remaining house from the 1820s. Actually, I should say it's the oldest house here in Washington. It's a beautiful place, but you have to realize in the 1820s, this wasn't necessarily the way it looked. For if you can pull the walls out and get into the interior of this house, you'll see a log cabin. And it wasn't long before Washington began to have some real essentials. A blacksmith shop opened, then more and more stores, as more and more families seeking a better life in what was then the West began to settle here. And as the city grew, so did the need for a cemetery. Years ago, prior to the Civil War, this entire 3 or 4 block area was earmarked as a cemetery. The oldest graves were moved here when this area was used for the high school and the swimming pool and the National Guard Armory. But here's John Scudder. John Scudder, buried here, served with George Washington. Then the stagecoach came, and that started a new surge in growth for the little town that was once called Liverpool. And then just before the Civil War, something magic happened here in Washington. Something came here that would really put the city on the map. And that something was the railroad. Then in 1880, some of the city fathers got together here and threw a bunch of money at the railroad and said, we've got an idea. And that idea was for the railroad to consolidate a lot of repair operations that had been going on in several cities to right here. The guys got together and threw the money at the railroad and said, for 100 years, you can have all this property for nothing. So by the time the First and Second World Wars came along, this place was hopping. There were huge buildings like this capable of having entire steam engines lifted up so they could work on them. But all that died out. This all became derelict. There have been a few companies in here in the meantime that have painted boxcars and done some repair. But only this remnant of the old roundhouse really remains as kind of a ghost of a long time ago when the railroad was the industry here in Washington. And when railroad builders cut through a hill on the east side of town building this overhead bridge, they hit a seam of coal. And yes, coal became another important industry here. And at one time, when this was the B&O, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, that was the lovely train station. Before that, there was a ramshackle wooden building there. It had been moved about a block down there and became the freight station for many years. As a child, I remember there were 3 or 4 passenger trains a day, each direction through here. And because crews had to stop here, this is where the train carrying the body of Dwight Eisenhower stopped. And for one brief moment that day, American media attention was focused on this train station. Over the years, Washington became quite a city, with beautiful churches, an incredible park, great schools, basketball champion teams, and one of the state's most beautiful courthouses. It is a city that is very different today than when it was founded. It is a city that owes its modern-day roots to the railroad. And there was another rail line that ran through Washington. You can almost see the cracks as to where it was covered up. Washington had a light rail, a trolley. It's a classic example of memories of my childhood that aren't here anymore. And there's one other thing in this area I can't find. It's over here. And what I remember from my childhood is that there used to be a bridge railing here, a concrete bridge railing, and one on this side, and one on the next block over. Because you see, Washington used to have creeks running through it. The big ballpark downtown, maybe I should say ball field, Allen Field, used to have an open creek sewer running through what is now the outfield. It's all infrastructure, but it isn't here anymore. And maybe that was one of the sad things about coming home to a city that is soon to celebrate its bicentennial. And that is, a lot of the things from my childhood, some of the history, just aren't here anymore. I'm Dennis Daly.